Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see you here in this wonderful, full house we have this evening. First of all, thank you for your patience in coming into this building. It's obviously difficult getting 900 people in that relatively short space of time, so thank you for your patience, and sorry if you've had to wait either outside or in here, but it's wonderful to see you all here this evening. My name's Mark Williamson. I'm Director of Action for Happiness. We're the organisation that's putting on the event this evening. I know many of you have been to our events before, and I'm sure, like me, you're hugely excited about our guest speaker, Daniel Goleman, this evening, who we're absolutely delighted to have here. I just wanted to start with saying a few words about Action for Happiness and a little bit later on about some of the other things we'll be doing that we'd love you to be involved with. But just for anyone who's not familiar with us, we are a movement of people who, I'm sure, like many in this room, believe that what matters most in life is human happiness and well-being. It should be the priority for our leaders, and it should also, I think, be the guiding principle for how we lead our lives. And so people who join the Action for Happiness movement make a simple pledge to live in a way that creates more happiness and less unhappiness in the world around. So it's not just about their own lives and our own lives, it's about the way we treat each other, it's about our relationships and the contribution we make in the society we find ourselves in. So just in the spirit of Action for Happiness, and to kick things off this evening, I know you've been chatting to the people next to you, but I just wanted to start with a very, very simple, quick exercise, which is just to say, each of you, can you think about the last 24 hours, the last day of your life, whatever's been happening since you've come here or on your way here, and just think about one good thing that's happened for you in the last 24 hours, whatever it is, large or small. And I'd just like it if you can hold that in your mind and turn to somebody other than the person you've just been chatting to while waiting, and just share something good that's happened for you in the last day, and then listen to something good that's happened for them in the last day. And let's start with a little bit of sharing some good news. So over to you for just 30 seconds each of something good. Lovely. So I hope you enjoyed sharing your good news and hearing somebody else's. I'd love to hear some of those stories, but we should get on with the evening. But we feel it's so important in a world that's so often focused on what's wrong that we sometimes regularly stop and ask ourselves what's right. Even in the most difficult and bleak of days, there are still things that are good and that we can be grateful for. So what I'd just like to do is really introduce Dan and set the scene for this evening's event. We are so thrilled to have him here, such a distinguished expert in this area. And many of you will, of course, know that probably 15 or so years ago now, Dan wrote a book which had such a huge impact on certainly on my life, but also on so many other aspects of society, in education, in the way that we think about relationships in the workplace, fundamentally challenging this assumption that it's our intellect, it's our IQ that matters most in having a good and successful life and a good and successful society. Emotional intelligence was, of course, the phrase that Dan coined for us and has now become such a part of the way we talk about so many aspects of what matters in terms of our psychological and mental health, our relationships, our education, and many other areas. Of course, Dan hasn't stopped there. He's moved on to many other wonderful books and works and areas of expertise. But I think what we have a chance to see this evening, as well as, I think, reliving some of Dan's emotional intelligence insights, is to see something almost as powerful and with such a potential to be like that book in terms of changing the way we look at the world. So as you'll hopefully see later on, there are some copies of Dan's new book, Focus, here this evening, which is really brand new and I think most importantly setting an agenda which is so at threat in the modern world about how our attention is focused, or indeed often not focused. So I think what we're going to hear this evening are some messages that are hugely important, not just for us as individuals, but for the future of society and indeed the way we structure our organizations, the way we teach our children, and the way we live together. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guest this evening, Daniel Goleman.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I was just thinking, what an amazing Twitter feed it would be if each of us were to tweet what you just told that person. It's the good news, and we don't hear the good news. The news we read in the papers and see, in the media generally, is news for the amygdala, news for the part of the brain which is the radar for threat. It's the terrible things that happen, the things to worry about, the bad news. And we really need a balance because, truth to tell, on any given day, in any given hour around the world, if you were to take all the small acts of kindness that were done, on the one hand, and on the other hand, take all of the terrible things that happen, the acts of kindness would by far outweigh the worrisome things, the bad things. We need to focus more on the good news. And focus, which is the topic I've been most interested in, is extremely important. I'd like to bring home that importance to you over the course of the evening. Let me begin by telling you about an experiment. It's a classic in social psychology. Some of you may know about it. It was done at the Princeton Theological Seminary with divinity students. The students were told that they were going to give a practice sermon. And they have about 15 minutes to prepare. Then they go to another building, give the sermon, and be evaluated. Half of the students were given the parable of the Good Samaritan, the man who stopped to help the stranger in need by the side of the road. The other half were given random topics from the Bible. So each student gets their 15 minutes. They run over to the other building. On the way over, they pass a man who's bent over and moaning in pain. The question is, do they stop? Interesting question. More important, does it matter if you're mulling the parable of the Good Samaritan? What do you think? Didn't matter. What made the difference was how much time pressure people thought they were under. If you feel pressured, you just don't notice. Our world collapses. And today, attention is a mental faculty under siege. We have more and more incoming information, more and more to do in less time. There's less and less time that's truly away from work. They can find you at home. There was a very telling experiment done about attention. It's done at Harvard, but with a national American sample, probably the same data here. People were given an iPhone app, and the app called them at random times during the day. And it asked two questions. What are you doing now? And what are you thinking about? Turns out people's minds are wandering on average 50% of the time. They're most focused, no surprise, when they're making love. However, who answers an app like that? I don't think it's a good idea. The worst focus was if people were commuting to work, sitting in front of a computer, or at work. Employers take notice. I've been adding attention to emotional intelligence since I've gotten into this literature. Mark asked me to talk about the global impact of emotional intelligence. I'm really quite amazed by it. It turns out that globally, in two sectors, it's become very influential. One is education, I'm happy to say, and the other is leadership in organizations. In education, there's now a movement to insert into the standard curriculum lessons in self-awareness and managing your emotions well, empathy, in relationships, which are the elements of emotional intelligence. It's called social emotional learning. And it's been going on now for more than a decade. There was recently a study published that it aggregated more than 500 separate studies of schools where kids had this kind of education and those where they didn't. And it showed that antisocial behavior, fights and bullying and so on, goes down about 10% on average, more in schools that need it more. Pro-social behavior, liking school, feeling someone at school cares about you, attendance and so on, go up by 10%. The really interesting finding is that academic achievement scores go up by 11%. Kids are less absorbed in, the melodramas. She didn't invite me to her party. These are the things that really capture kids' attention. But if you know how to handle those situations better, you have more focus for what you have to learn. The second is leadership, and this is gratifying too. It turns out that if you do, in an organization, you look at the leaders who are really most effective, top 10% by whatever metric makes sense in that sector, and you compare the top 10% to people who are just average, who are in the same role, you can find, if you do a systematic analysis, you can find abilities or competencies that the stars have that you don't see in the average. And it turns out that if you look at those competencies that emerge, that distinguish the stars, and you look at whether they're based on purely cognitive abilities, like intelligence or a technical skill, for example, versus this emotional intelligence repertoire from self-awareness to relationship skills, for star leaders, 80 to 90% of the competencies that distinguish the stars from the average are based on emotional intelligence. I know you're thinking, well, then why is that guy the boss in where I work, right? But people get promoted for all kinds of reasons. What can I say? So emotional intelligence, in a sense, is a model of well-being. It's a model of what makes us happy. And I realize that attention has been the missing ingredient, and I'm now trying to integrate it into that model. The first part of emotional intelligence is self-awareness, being able to attune to our thoughts, our feelings, and to use that information. For example, I grew up in the Central Valley of California. It's a vast farming region. In fact, the city I grew up in was mostly an agricultural industry. And there was a fellow about my age who grew up in the next town over. Our schools were rivals. We played always that was the big game. And he was a terrible student. He almost flunked out, what we call high school in the States. But he went to a local two-year college and found his way to film. And it turned out he loved film. And he managed to get into a film school and made a student film that caught the eye of a director who hired him for regular feature film as an assistant. He did so well there that he was given a film to direct, and he did so well with that they let him direct a script that he had written. And that did surprisingly well. So they let him do another. At least they wanted him, the studio wanted him to do another. But he hated how the studio, which had the right to final cut, had what he thought butchered his creative effort. He said, I am not going to let a studio have final say. So he went out on his own, paid for the movie himself. Everyone that he knew in the film industry said, this is a huge mistake. Did it anyway, didn't care. And he ran out of money. He went to 10, 11 banks. It took, I think, 11 banks before he got a loan to finish the film. You may have seen the film. It's called Star Wars. So George Lucas made the decision to take the risk to make that film on his own, not because he was going to make $4 billion, as it turned out, but because he wanted creative control. It was because he was very principled and had a value. In fact, ancillary rights, which is where he made a lot of money. Do you have in the UK lunchboxes with Darth Vader and Princess Leia on this? Yeah. In those days, it was just T-shirts and posters. It was worthless. He had no idea that it was going to matter. But it was by attuning to his inner small voice that he realized, I can't do it any other way. There's some research on what's called good work. Good work combines what we're excellent at, that is our best skills, what we enjoy doing, what engages us, what we're passionate about, and our ethics, what matters to us, our sense of purpose and meaning. And if you can combine those three things, you'll be doing work, it might be an avocation, but you'll be doing something you love doing because it's meaningful to you. And it takes the ability to tune inwardly to find your way to good work. But one question is, how much of what I do now could I consider good work? What could I do over the next 5 years to make it a larger proportion? Because it's in doing good work that our attention naturally gets super focused. You get into a state called flow. Flow is has emerged in studies. How many of you have heard of flow? So you know that it's a state for optimal performance, where your skills are really called upon at the utmost, where you're very flexible in your ability to adjust to things, and it feels good. Flow is a positive, joyous state. And being able to work that way is a real treasure. The second part of emotional intelligence is self-management. Being able to handle your distressing emotions so they don't overwhelm you, being able to marshal your positive emotions, joy, passion, so on, to do what you love doing, or to do what you have to do even. And one of the early markers of this self-management is called cognitive control. You see it in a 4-year-old child. Some of you may have heard of the marshmallow test. It's another legendary study. It was done at Stanford University. 4-year-olds from the preschool there are brought one by one into a room, sit down at a small table, a big juicy marshmallow is put on the table, and the experimenter says, you could have this now if you want, but if you wait till I run an errand and don't eat it till I get back, you can have 2 then. Then she leaves the room. This is a predicament that tries the soul of any 4-year-old, I assure you. I've seen video, it's really fun, it's very cute. Some just go up to it and smell it and then jump back like it was dangerous, and other kids just go off in a corner, sing and dance to themselves to distract themselves. And some just can't stand it. They gobble it down right on the spot. And about a third wait the endless 10, 12, 15 minutes, whatever it was, till the experimenter comes back, they get 2. The payoff finding comes 14 years later when they're about to go to university. They're tracked down, and the 2 groups are compared, the ones who waited and the ones who gobbled. And what they find is the ones who waited get along better with their peers. They still can delay gratification in pursuit of their goals, which is basically what this is a test of. And surprisingly, on the American University Entrance Exam, the SAT, the top score is 1,400. The kids who waited had a 210-point advantage over those who grabbed. And this is really interesting. Remember, these are all the children of people at Stanford, very high IQ families. So what's going on? Kids who can't manage their impulse, who can't delay gratification, are constantly distracted. So they can't pay as much attention to what the teacher is saying, to their studies. And I think that's what may account for the difference. So in a city in New Zealand, they took every child born over the course of a year, about 1,037 kids, and they tested them very rigorously for cognitive control, many different tests, including the marshmallow test, from age 4 to 8. And then they tracked them down in their 30s. And what they found was that a child's cognitive control was a better predictor of their financial success in their 30s and of their physical health than was IQ or the social economic status of the family they grew up in. That's a rather stunning finding. And that what they also found was that children who started out not so good at this, but who improved over the course of childhood, ended up doing as well as the kids who were always good. And in fact, one of the conclusions from that study is that we should be teaching these abilities to every child. I'll get back to that. The third part of emotional intelligence is empathy, being able to attune to the other person and know how someone else is feeling, understand how they see the world. This depends on something called the social brain. It's a newly discovered, last 5, maybe 10 years at most. This part of the brain, or this circuitry within the brain, emerged when neuroscientists stopped studying just one brain and one body and one person and started studying 2 brains and 2 bodies while people interacted. And they discovered that the forebrain, the last part of the brain to emerge in evolution, is designed to link to the other brain. It works like this. One of the first cells in this circuitry to be discovered happened quite by accident. It was at a lab in Italy. It was a lab studying the motor cortex of monkeys, the part of the brain that moves the body. And they're studying cells one by one. And what they found was that one cell, for example, only fired when the monkey lifted its arm. Didn't do anything any other time. But one afternoon, it was firing and the monkey wasn't moving. They couldn't understand what was going on. Then they realized it was a hot day, a lab assistant had gone out for a gelato, and he's standing in front of the monkey, and every time he lifts his arm to take a lick, the monkey's neuron for the same movement fires. They're called mirror neurons, and our brain is peppered with them. And what it means is that when we're face to face with someone, we get an instant readout of what they're doing, what they're intending, what they're feeling. It creates a brain-to-brain link that keeps us on the same page. And there are many other circuits now that have emerged. There's circuit, for example, that when someone we're with is in pain, our circuitry for experiencing pain lights up. So we have this immediate sense of connectedness, or we do ordinarily. And I think it's important to understand when we do and when we don't. There was a study at Harvard Medical School of doctor-patient interactions. They measured the physiology and they videotaped the session. And after the patient leaves, they asked the patient to look at the video and say, tell us when you felt the doctor really was listening, really cared, really understood, on the one hand. At times he didn't get it, wasn't listening, didn't care. So when the patient said the doctor didn't care right there, the two physiologies were completely independent. When the patient said, yeah, he really understood, it was like two birds flying in formation. In other words, this brain-to-brain link operates in our entire biology. There was another study, very telling, done at University of Wisconsin. Women are getting their brain scanned and they're told, you're going to get an electric shock. Mild electric shock, but enough to be apprehensive about. And their circuitry for alarm and anxiety, starts flaring up. Understandable. If someone holds the woman's hand, it goes down a little bit. If the woman's husband holds her hand, it goes completely quiet. We are biological allies for the people who love us and who we love the most. This is very important to understand because it's not known really, it's not acknowledged, but it's felt. If someone's in hospital and you go and sit with them, it makes a difference that you're there. Presence makes a difference. There are 3 ingredients to rapport. First ingredient is full mutual attention. Second ingredient follows from that. It's a nonverbal synchrony. So, for example, if 2 people are really connecting, really clicking, really have chemistry, and you make a video of the interaction and play it back without the soundtrack and just look at the bodies, you'll see that it's as though they were choreographed. People are moving, in response to each other very elegantly. It's done with a set of neurons called oscillators. Oscillators determine how we respond to the body in front of us or to anything in front of us. Oscillators are extremely important for human survival. And the reason is this. At the moment of a first kiss, oscillators determine how quickly the velocity is at which those skulls come together. And if they get it wrong, it would be very bad for human survival. So thank goodness for oscillators. So there's two things, full mutual attention, nonverbal synchrony, and the third is very interesting, flow. It feels good. It feels good to connect fully with someone like that. It's a microflow, a mutual microflow. This nonverbal communication of emotions is operating in every interaction. I remember some years ago, my wife and I were at a very fancy deli in the swanky part of Manhattan, and I was coming down with a cold. My wife had ordered chicken soup, and when the waiter brought the soup, I had the thought, that might help my cold. I bet she wouldn't mind if I shared it with her. And so I said to the waiter, could I have an empty bowl? I'd like to share my wife's soup. He looked at me like I'd crawled out from under a rock. He said, in a kind of disgusted tone of voice, I'll see what I can do, and stalked off, and came back and flung a bowl down. I thought, okay, This waiter gets no tip, and I'm not coming back to this restaurant, right? Later, my cold's getting worse. And I think, well, maybe some herbal tea would help. So I stop a different waiter, and I say, excuse me, do you have any herbal tea? And he looks at me with real empathy. He says, very concerned, he says, you look like you're coming down with a cold. Then he goes into all of the teas that his mother used to give him when he had a cold, and which ones they had, and which one he'd recommend. And I thought, okay, he'll get the tip, and I'll come back to the restaurant. It's this subterranean dialogue, brain to brain and body to body, is extremely important in human affairs. It's just unacknowledged, it's unrecognized. But it helps to know that it exists. The fourth element of emotional intelligence is social skill, which means that we have good, strong connections and interactions. I don't know how many of you are of an age where you remember a book by a philosopher named Martin Buber called I and Thou. Some people are nodding. I and thou is about two modes of relating. The I-it, where you treat the other person as an object, and the I-you, where you have a full connection, where you have rapport. In the I-it, you really don't care how what you do or what you say impacts the other person. It's as though you're firing bullets when you talk to them. It's just dot, dot, dot. I remember I stumbled upon an example of the I-it when I was in a sushi bar in New York. And I couldn't help but overhear the conversation next to me because I was sitting right next to these two women. And one of them is telling the other about her brother who's single and on the dating scene and having a really hard time. He was so desperate that he went to something, I don't know if you have it in London, it's called speed dating. Does that murmur mean yes or no? Yes? Yeah, well in the States, in speed dating, single women sit at a table with a timer on it. And gentlemen go from table to table and have a timed conversation, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and then ding, the bell rings, and the woman has an opportunity to decide whether to give contact information for a follow-up. And this woman says to her friend, and he has never gotten anyone's information, and I know exactly why. The reason is he's so nervous about impressing her that he just sits down and starts talking straight about himself, never asks a question about her. That's an I-it relationship. It doesn't work. The I-you, I was doing some other research in the New York Times, the other New York Times. The Sunday's paper has a section on marriages, and they do the backstory of a marriage they choose, and they're always very interesting, so I often read them. And I read the story of Cynthia Epstein-Charney. Cynthia Epstein-Charney, when she was dating as a single woman, had a little game she would play on the first date, and it was she would start a timer the moment the gentleman showed up to see how long it took him to ask a question with the word you in it. And apparently Mr. Charney iced the test because she ended up marrying him. So the difference between an I-it and an I-you determines, it's a kind of a metric for how connected, how rich, how looped in, brain to brain, our relationships are. And the stronger your relationships, I'm sure you know, in Action for Happiness, rich relationships is a better predictor of life happiness than income and so on. Mark was telling me a principle from Action for Happiness, that our happiness increases to the extent we care about others' happiness. I thought that is really wonderful, but I just read some troubling data, and the data comes from work at the University of California at Berkeley, and what it shows is that if two people are meeting for the first time, and one is a much higher socioeconomic status than the other, the person of the greater social power pays less attention to the person of lesser social power. And, you know, it's subtle, but it's measurable. And that is very troubling. He's found it in a half dozen studies that use different metrics and so on. It's very troubling to me because the gap between rich and poor is growing and growing and growing. And if people who have the power, who have the money, don't really notice, remember, noticing is the first step, then you attune, then you can empathize, and if a person is in need, you can have compassion, and then you can act if there's something you can do. But if you don't notice in the first place, you'll never go down that road. So I found it very, very troubling. I do remember when I was in graduate school, I met a member of the Guinness family. I guess the Guinness family is a wealthy family here. Is that right? Yeah. And his ambition was to go back to the UK, he was in university in the States, and work on an assembly line in an auto plant. And he hoped to be elected union steward. And if he were elected union steward, he hoped to run for parliament on the labor ticket. And I thought that is very interesting because what he's doing is putting himself in a situation where he will overcome that gap. And there's a fellow, Thomas Pettigrew, a psychologist who used to teach at Harvard when I was a graduate student there, who grew up in the American South at a time when there was terrible, terrible bigotry and prejudice. And he dedicated his career as a social psychologist to overcoming that kind of intergroup hostility. And lately, he had published a study, it's an aggregate of more than 500 different studies, about intergroup contact, which shows very, very strongly that even if there are two groups that are very, very hostile, if people from one group grow up or have friends with people from the other group, they don't share the prejudice. It's one of the best ways to overcome these kinds of divides, to heal them. If you don't do that, you're prone to what's called the narcissism of minor differences. It's a phrase from Freud. The narcissism of minor differences occurs when there are two groups who are largely the same, but have some kind of hostility or just don't know each other. And so people from one group or the other group seize on small things and exaggerate their importance. And we don't have it, but they do. Or we have it, but they don't. That's the narcissism. And it starts a spiral toward intergroup hostility. I heard recently that the idea that social class is equated with IQ has been espoused. I don't know the particulars of that. I heard it's in the air. That's actually a view that comes out of ignorance of the data. There's a very good researcher named Flynn who's established what's called the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect shows that it's not the family you're born into that determines your IQ, because of what's called neuroplasticity, which is that the brain continues to shape itself through repeated experience, and epigenetics, that is to say, genes don't determine whom you become, it's whether they're turned on or off by things in the environment that act on them. The Flynn effect shows that ever since the IQ test has been invented, every time they come out with a new version, and that's every 4 or 5 years, they have to make the questions harder. Because each generation, each successive generation is smarter than the generations before. So IQ increases across the board. The other thing is that if you look at societies in which there's a difference between a privileged class or caste and an underprivileged class or caste, you find a wide gap in IQ scores among kids. But that doesn't control for nutrition or educational opportunities and so on. But the really key thing is if members of the lower class or caste immigrate to a country where that bias does not exist, their children turn out to be as smart as anybody else. In other words, it disappears in a generation given the right circumstances. The experiment where they tracked children and found that cognitive control was a stronger predictor of life success than IQ. They also said that our conclusion is that we should teach children these skills. And that, in fact, there's a Nobel-winning economist at the University of Chicago, James Heckman, who argues that doing that systematically would improve the GNP of an economy significantly over time. Not the gross national happiness, GNH, but the GNP. So I was in a classroom recently in Spanish Harlem. Spanish Harlem is a very impoverished section of New York City. And I went to visit a second grade classroom. And in this second grade class, the kids were having their daily session of what they call breathing buddies. Breathing buddies begins with each child going to their cubby and getting their favorite small stuffed animal, finding a place to lie down on a carpet, putting the animal on their belly, and then watching their belly rise and fall, and counting 1, 2, 3 as it rises, 1, 2, 3 as it falls. And if their mind wanders off, they bring it back to the 1, 2, 3. That turns out to be an explicit lesson in cognitive control. Cognitive control means I can focus on this, and when my mind wanders over here, I notice it's wandered, and I can bring it back. That is the core of being able to resist the marshmallow, or to keep your mind on your studies. In fact, I think it's such a useful exercise that I think we should try it right now. It's not just for 7-year-olds. So what I'd like you to do is sit up in a dignified posture, not tense, but alert. I know it's late, but we'll just do this for a little bit. And close your eyes and bring your attention to your breath. Just the natural flow. Don't try to control it. And try to see if you can sense it at the tip of your nose. Just breathing out, breathing in. And watch the full out breath, the full in breath. If there's a pause between, stay with that. Be fully aware of each breath. Breathing out, breathing in. And if your mind wanders off and you notice it's wandered, just gently bring it back to the breath. Watch each breath from the beginning to the end. Start with the next. Okay, you can open your eyes. It's as simple as that. How many of you actually do some mindfulness or any kind of meditation? Quite a few. Well, if you do this simple exercise for, say, 20, 30 minutes a day, it starts to work on the muscle of attention. Attention is a mental muscle. And the basic workout for this mental muscle, it's like a rep in the gym. You know, every time you lift a weight, every repetition, the muscle gets stronger, just that much stronger. And every time you notice your mind wander and you bring it back, you're enriching the connectivity of the circuitry for concentration. And it pays off. There's a researcher named Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin who worked with a fellow named John Kabat-Zinn, who's the guy who made mindfulness well known in the West. They went to a very high-pressure biotech startup company, and they, it's 24/7, and people are stressed out, and they offered this to people there. And what they found was that if a group were to do this for 8 weeks, 30 minutes a day on average, there was a real shift. And the shift was in a measure that Davidson developed. His expertise is in emotions in the brain. And he discovered that when we're really anxious, uptight, angry, hassled, stressed, the right prefrontal area, just behind the forehead, is very active. Also, the amygdala, the brain's radar for danger. When we're really feeling great, what a nice day, energized, I could do anything today, you're in a good mood, this part is very quiet, but there's a lot of activity on the left. And each of us has has a ratio of activity right to left that predicts our mood range day to day. There's a bell curve for this. Most of us are in the middle. We have good days, we have bad days. If you're far to the right, you might be clinically depressed or clinically anxious. If you're far to the left, you bounce back from things. You're very resilient. So what he found was that before starting, the people in the biotech company tended to be slanted to the left. No, to the right. They're hassled. But after 8 weeks, they're starting to go back to the left. In other words, it was changing the emotional set point. Interestingly, phenomenologically, what people experienced was they spontaneously said, you know what, I'm starting to remember why I love this job. They felt much better about what they're doing. They're not feeling hassled. It's very meaningful work. They're developing drugs that could save people's lives, and they love the work. And they also, interestingly, were able to mobilize the flu shot better. When you get a flu shot, which you should do now, because flu season is coming, what it does is mobilize what are called antibody titers that help you resist the flu. And their bodies mobilize more antibody titers than in most people. So it had another effect, which was biological. It's good for you that way. And it's very, very simple. But I don't just believe in individual solutions for a better and happier society. I think we also need social solutions. An example that I love is what's known as the Greystone Bakery, which is in a part of New York in a very impoverished neighborhood. The Greystone Bakery takes people, families and parents who are homeless, gives them housing and trains them to bake. And the Greystone Bakery supplies a company called Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream. Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream is now owned by Unilever. Do you have it? You don't have it in Britain. You do? Okay. So they make brownies for a flavor called chocolate fudge brownie. And if you're a chocolate lover, you have to try chocolate fudge brownie. Amazing. But they send truckloads of brownies up to Vermont, where the ice cream factory is in the States. But what I like about this is the motto of the company. The motto of the company is, we don't hire people to bake brownies, we bake brownies to hire people. Think about that. In other words, it's a difference in values. It's a difference in priorities. I was at a conference recently where the Dalai Lama gave an address on ethics. And he gave this advice: when you face a decision, ask yourself these 3 questions. Who benefits? Is it just me or a group? Is it just my group or everyone? Is it just for the present or is it for the future? Leadership, in my view, really refers to having a sphere of influence. And for some people it's large, some people it's intimate, whatever it may be, we all have spheres of influence. We're all leaders. And I think we all can make a difference. Some of you may have been here. Matthew Ricard came to speak at Action for Happiness. Matthew is a really interesting guy. He got his PhD at Pasteur Institute in cell biology, and his advisor actually got a Nobel Prize for the research they were working on. But Matthew decided to leave the field and go to the Himalayas and become a monk. And basically he's been meditating for decades now. And Matthew was actually studied by Richard Davidson, who's doing work on contemplative neuroscience. And his brain is, the set point, he's very far to the left. And another psychologist named Paul Ekman, who's the world's expert on the facial expression of emotion and communicability of emotion, wanted to study Matthew. And he wanted to know what kind of influence or impact does Matthew have when people interact with him. So he designed an experiment where Matthew would have a debate with someone who was really very different. So Ekman did a quiet phone survey of the faculty at the University of California, San Francisco. He wanted to identify the most obstinate, abrasive, confrontational professor in the university. Oddly enough, everybody agreed who that was. So he calls Professor X and he says, in the interests of science, would you take part in an experiment? Professor X says, of course, I'd be delighted. But as the day grew nearer and nearer, he started making demands which became more and more unreasonable. So they dumped Professor X. They went with the second most difficult guy. And he comes in, and he and Matthew are going to debate the premise that, oh, I see a friend. Rukmini? Yes. Rukmini, who's here, God bless her, typed my doctoral dissertation when I was at Harvard. God bless you. So they're going to have a debate. And the debate is on the premise that the professor should do what Matthew did. He should give up his very well-paid, secure, tenured professorship and go to a hermitage and meditate for the rest of his life. So they're measuring physiology, and the professor is very agitated. He doesn't like this idea at all. Matthew's totally calm. They start having a discussion, the debate. Matthew stays completely calm. The professor gets calmer and calmer and calmer. By the end of 15 minutes, he doesn't want to stop. He's having such a delightful time. Emotions are contagious, for better or for worse. And I remember, you don't have to be a decades-long meditator. I remember years ago, I was waiting for a bus on a hot and humid day in August in New York. And the bus pulls up, and I don't know about here, but in New York, on a day like that, people feel a little prickly. They have this invisible bubble, like, don't touch me, don't talk to me, I'm a little irritable. So I had my bubble, and I get on the bus, and the bus driver did something very unusual for New York. He actually spoke to me. He said, hi, how has your day been? He really wanted to know. I was a little shocked, but I took my seat. Then I realized this bus driver is carrying on a conversation with everyone on the bus. Oh, you're looking for suits, are you? You should try this department store on the right. They've got a great sale. Did you hear about the Monet exhibit in the museum up here on the left? It's fabulous. You should go see it. And you know the Cineplex up here? I know the one in Cinema 5 got great reviews. I saw the one in Cinema 3 last night. It's wonderful. You should go see it. On and on and on. People would get off that bus and he'd say, I hope your day is a wonderful, wonderful day. And people were transformed. That man was an urban saint. He was spreading ripples of good feeling in a city that sorely needed them. And I think the bottom line is that no matter what we do, no matter who we are, we can all be agents in the conspiracy to make this world a happier place. Thank you very much. I'm happy to entertain questions. There are people with mics, I'm told. So if you can raise your hand, we'll get a mic to you. Anybody have a question? Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. One thing that strikes me is that most of the people studying happiness, well-being, etc., are psychologists. And I thought your example about the brownie thing is really interesting, because you said we've got to go move beyond the individual and look at the social thing. And I'm in international relations and politics, and we just focus on human misery, conflict, poverty, blah, 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 and fear and criminology and that stuff. So I was wondering, am I right that this is mostly dominated by psychologists. If so, what do we do about it to get other disciplines involved?
To get more disciplines and fields involved in this, you mean?
In the study of happiness and well-being, because it seems the disciplines which study the big macro factors are focused on misery.
Yeah, well, psychology was in the same predicament as, say, political science, which studies basically conflict and misery, right? Which was that from its inception until very recently, psychology studied pathology. In other words, misery and conflict. And it took a few dedicated people within the field to say, hey, we're missing the boat. There's a whole range of human experience. So, for example, as I said, the news is biased toward unhappiness. And fields like political science are biased toward unhappiness. They don't see the bias. So it would be interesting if people within, say, political science were to advocate for studying the actually much vaster aspect of human activity, which is positive. People helping people, communities working together to solve problems. In other words, is that a field? Is it now? Could it become so? Could it become a bigger field? Because if we understand how people can get along, rather than study only what makes them miserable and in conflict, we might be able to promote that better. I was just at Oxford talking to someone who's in political science, but his specialty is humanitarian aid. I find that very interesting, because what people who are doing humanitarian aid is being agents for the good within the misery. In fact, they take the misery and face it straight on and see what they can do to reduce it. And I think the more we can reinforce that, not just in political science, but in other analogous fields, the better we would be. Thank you. It's a great question. There's one over here.
Hello. You mentioned that you're...
Who has the mic?
Over here.
Over there, yes. Hi.
Hi there. You mentioned that your recent work was around attention and focus. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and in particular any practical application that it has.
If I could talk about focus, and I didn't hear the rest. I'm sorry, the speaker is...
Your recent work, you mentioned, was around attention and focus.
Yes, yes.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit around any practical application that's come out of that work.
Somehow the last phrase of what you said escaped me. Talk about focus and...
How it relates to human happiness,
how it relates to human happiness. Okay, sure. So I tried to make that clear. Let me restate it. But for example, when we're highly focused, when we're really absorbed, we get into a state called flow, which is a state of happiness, in fact. But I don't think that's the only way it relates. I think that there are four kinds of attention, two kinds really, in two applications within the emotional intelligence model. Internal awareness, self-awareness, that is a kind of attention. And the better we are at it, the better we can navigate our lives in ways that will bring us, say, to good work or get us into situations that allow happiness or help us manage our own internal emotional world so that we don't get overwhelmed by negative emotions and we can promote positive emotions. And so the cognitive control actually helps us do that, and that's an intentional dimension. The other way is empathy, being able to attune, to focus on the other person, because it's through strong, positive relationships that our life becomes enriched and that we can help other people also find happiness. Thank you. There's a question here and one over here.
Is this on? Yeah. I'm in the field of positive communications and positive news and positive filmmaking, which is kind of not terribly popular, but I think it is growing, in the mainstream media. And I'm very interested in what you say about the fact that emotions are catching, which they obviously are.
Sure.
Has any studies been done about what determines whether whether the rageful person catches the peace or the peaceful person catches the rage. And if you're a high empath, I'm extremely empathic. And it's great in some ways, but my God, I find I can't hold my own.
Oh, yeah. Who's the sender, who's the receiver? Yeah. It's a very good question. If emotions communicate person to person, who sends, who receives? There are a few things that determine it. For example, there have been studies in psychology where two strangers come into a lab, they fill out a mood checklist, how do you feel now? They sit facing each other in silence for 2 minutes and then fill out the same checklist. And it turns out the person in the dyad who's more expressive communicates his or her emotions to the other person. That's one factor. The second is that generally in groups, the more powerful person sends emotions and others receive. So for example, in team situations, when the team leader is in a negative mood, people in the team tend to catch the mood and performance goes down. If the leader is in a very positive mood, people catch the mood, performance goes up. So power is another factor. The third factor is how stable you are in the emotion. So if you're like Matthew, then you can convert the professor and bring him into a positive mood range. There may be other factors, but those occur to me. Who has the mic? Power of the mic. There's 1, 2, 3 questions here. Let's go with you. Go right here.
Hello. Dan, thanks for that nice things, and I was in tune. I have a very strange question. It looks strange. I can't understand what is the meaning of happiness, and is it happiness with whom? Is it for outside? It's inside? How I know I'm happy?
Oh, you're happy now. You're smiling. That's how you know. You have to.
It's a question. If I'm teaching, I'm a teacher. So
You're a
if
teacher.
I want to explain to my students what is the happiness, how do I explain? For instance, I was not getting ticket for this. I got ticket in the waiting. I was happy then. I'm happy now, but I don't know what is meaning of happiness.
Well, you
I
know,
was
there are
happy
many kinds.
myself. I'm getting
Sure.
something.
Yeah.
It's a material world which is giving me happiness. It's
Yes.
inside. So it's a long question.
Yeah, so I would say happiness is something inside, and that it's related to feeling good. Smiles are a clue. Laughing is a surefire sign. You know what? Your kids already know what it means. You don't have to define it for them, really. But what's interesting, here's a concept for you. Can you be happy for no reason? In other words, can you cultivate an inner state of well-being that's not dependent on circumstance? I've heard that it's possible. Let's try. Next question. Oh, here's the mic here. Yes, ma'am.
Hello. You mentioned that you were troubled by the information about actually the inequality gap and IQ being less for poorer people.
Yeah.
I'm internally happy, generally speaking, all the time.
I see.
And therefore, I came up with an answer. Hope you don't mind.
Okay.
And that is that once you've got that information, that's great, really, because you can spread that information. You can tell people, high up people who count, if you like, authorities, or you can spread that information via your books, your machine, whatever, that this is a real thing and it's happening now and it needs to be changed. And that you have ideas and ways of how to change it by educating kids and making it a standard thing in school.
Well, yeah, and I think we all, as I said, we all have spheres of influence. So we all can be spreading that same message.
Absolutely.
So that's a great answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I add one sentence?
Yes, sure.
And that is that really, when they said it was going to be the end of the world, 2012, whatever, I actually think it was the end of the dreadful world. It was the beginning, rather than the end of something, it was the beginning of something new. And I think there's a really special thing happening at the moment. There's more and more people who are interested in spreading good stuff learning about good stuff, doing actual happiness, learning how to be, like you say, all the kids, they know how to be happy inside anyway. It's just a case of the older people learning how to do it too.
I hope you're right. That's great. Who has the mic? Yes.
Hi. It's quite loud. Louder than I was expecting. My question is to do with the relationship between, I guess, positive feelings and negative feelings. There's a great film by Mike Leigh called Secrets and Lies, and it's all about a very dysfunctional family who are constantly outwardly very positive and saying, life's great, but inwardly they've all got their own particular issues and they're not really talking to each other. And as the sort of film goes on, they actually connect with the negative, essentially to acknowledge to each other and to themselves that actually life isn't quite so great. And actually there's a sort of paradox there in connecting with the negative. It actually, for the viewer, I think, and also for the people involved, has an uplifting effect. And I think that sort of paradox between negative and positive is interesting.
And I think there's a danger in mistaking espoused happiness for enacted happiness. They're not the same. And there's actually, you know who wrote very beautifully about this? R.D. Laing, the psychoanalyst, wrote about the myth of the happy family, which is in certain families that have a lot of pathology, there's a cover story that we're a happy family. So we wouldn't look in any, to see if there's any unhappiness because, of course, we don't have any because we're a happy family. So I think that it's important to be authentically happy, not just happy because we like the idea. Yeah. And the mic is where?
Over here.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Daniel. I wondered if you've got any examples of personal practice, what people do to work on their happiness and their emotional well-being.
Sure. Well, I happen to be partial to my wife's two books, which are about this. One is called Emotional Alchemy, and the other just came out recently. It's called Mind Whispering. And they're both, my books are nice, but they're very theoretical. She's a psychotherapist. She was one of the first to combine mindfulness and cognitive therapy. Her books are books you can actually use to handle the ways in which unhappy states or modes of beings capture us, and how to move from there to a state of genuine well-being. So her name is Tara Bennett Goleman. Emotional Alchemy and Mind Whispering are the books, and I found them very useful personally. I've also found her very useful personally. But yes.
Thank you. Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
Thank you. It's a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
My question's about the impact of technology on happiness and focus. I found myself, and I wonder if other people here have a kind of a real lack of focus,
Sure.
technology, checking your
Sure.
emails, stuff like that.
Yep.
What's the impact of technology on focus and happiness?
Okay,
And
yeah, sure.
is there a possibility of a positive impact? Because I can't think of one.
Well, consider this. In the year 2007, Time magazine, which is a major American magazine, had a small article which said there's a new word in the English language. The word is pizzled. It's a combination of puzzled and pissed off. And it's the way you feel when the person you're with suddenly whips out their BlackBerry and ignores you and starts talking. Well, the word pizzled died along with the BlackBerry, right? The new social norm is to divide attention, or in other words, to ignore the person you're with and look at a screen. You go to a romantic restaurant and you'll see couples at a table and they're both looking at their phones, not into each other's eyes. I saw a kid about 8 or 9 years old riding his bike and texting while he was riding. So, it's just creeping in. And so, you can be at work and you're doing fine. All of a sudden there's a pop-up. Oh, you've got an email. Well, I've got to look at that, right? Or, you've got tweets, or you've got this text, and, there's just an inundation. What's happening is that technology is insidiously invading our focus. And because of that, I argue we have to get better at focusing. That's why I think it's important to teach kids cognitive control. Cognitive control means I'm not going to look at that email. I'm going to continue with this. And it's important for adults to do it at work. That same study that showed that people's minds are wandering at work also found that the more your mind wanders, the less happy you are. And one of the reasons is that the circuitry for mind wandering tends to focus on problems, concerns we have, particularly in relationships. She didn't email me back. I have to now review all the things I did that make her hate me. That's the way that part of the mind works. So to the extent we can turn it off when we want and stay focused on what we have to do or the person we're with, our life is better off. And there are new apps. This is very interesting. On the one hand, technology invades us, and then it starts selling us things to turn off the invasion. So there are apps that will make you unable to go to your web browser for a certain number of minutes or hours that you determine, or stop those pop-ups from coming. It's a way of taking control over the external invasion, but then there's our internal willpower, which we can increase. And this little attention strengthener we did is one way of doing that. So I think we need to take back our attention from technology. And it is mixed. For example, video games. Video games, and kids can spend hours focused on video games. Can't do their homework, but they can do the video game. Right? So the literature is showing positives and negatives. I was just talking to a young man last night who loves strategy games. And it's really doing two things, those kinds of games. They're enhancing his ability to stay focused and also to think strategically. Well, that's good. If you are one of the kinds of kids who love battle games where you're like killing people or they're killing you and it's very bloody, it has two kinds of benefits. One, you have to stay really vigilant for something that's going to pop up and kill you. And that would make you a very good air traffic controller, for example. On the other hand, it means that when the kid bumps you in the hall, you assume he has a grudge against you rather than it was an accident. That is, it gives you a negative attribution bias. So it's very mixed. There's a new generation of video games being designed to enhance attention. One of them actually was designed by Richard Davidson. It's called Tenacity. My grandchildren played it, and they liked it. It's a game on an iPad, and every time you breathe out, you tap the screen. So what it's doing is helping you pay attention to your breath. On the fifth breath, you tap twice. And if you do that, then you get a visual reward, like flowers bloom in the desert or something. They liked it a lot. It gets harder and harder as you get better and better. What that is doing is explicitly strengthening the attentional function. So I think there's going to be a new generation of games that will have options that are more positive. But meanwhile, I think we've got to take a strong stand in our lives and create a boundary for those things. I don't know where the mic is.
One more over here.
Yes.
So I've read Search Inside Yourself, which I think you contributed to, and I believe that I should practice mindful meditation, and I've been trying for 6 months. And generally I think I'm happier, but I do find myself having to discipline myself to do the meditation. I avoid it, and yet I know it's good for me. Do you have any practical advice?
Well, this may encourage you. I'm an avid meditator, but I learned it in college. For the first 6 months that I meditated, I fell asleep every time I had a nap. But I kept at it. Sometimes it helps when you're just beginning to have a guided voice. For that reason, I created 3 audio instruction CDs. You can download them. One is called, they're at morethansound.net, www.morethansound.net. There's one for kids, one for teenagers, one for adults. And there are many. John Kabat-Zinn has wonderful audio voice instruction for mindfulness. But the reason it's good to start there is that our mind is wired to wander. And what we need is the external reminder that, oh yeah, you're wandering, bring it back. Remember, that's the strengthener. So it might be helpful for you to get one of these, there are dozens and dozens of them, and try to play that for a while during your mindfulness session. Yeah.
Hi, my question has two parts. First is related to social comparison. Largely we're unhappy because we compare ourselves to other people rather than thinking of what we actually have. So my question is how to get rid of social comparison, or are we bound as humans to always engage in that? And the second part is, could the Buddhist teaching of anatta or selflessness help overcome social comparison?
So social comparison is quite automatic in the brain. And the comparison that makes you feel bad is comparing up. So if you compare down, that's an antidote to someone who's less fortunate, because it reminds you of how fortunate you are, or how good you are, or how positive you can be. I was in touch lately with Aaron Beck, who's the man who invented cognitive therapy. And Dr. Beck is 93 now. He had a terrible fall. He's in a wheelchair. And he's the most positive person. He said, you know, I recently lost sight in one eye, but I can read with my other eye. Very positive voice. Then later, he lost vision in the other eye. He said, you know, I can listen. I can still hear. I can listen to books on tape. In other words, he focuses on the positive. And having a positive focus like that is fantastic. Rukmini and I know someone named Ramdas, who had a terrible stroke, almost died many years ago, and slowly recovered. But when you see him, he is the most positive, loving person that you can imagine. And he is living in dire circumstances. But it's because he's done this internal work. And the internal work, it's not just Buddhism. Every spiritual tradition values compassion and values loving kindness. And there are many methods for cultivating that attitude. And the Dalai Lama says the first beneficiary of an attitude of compassion is the one who holds it. And in fact, what they've found is that when you're feeling compassion, our positive emotional circuitry lights up. So cultivating a compassionate attitude is another way, another antidote to that. So remember that, compare down first, be positive, and cultivate compassion. And take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning.
Dr. Goleman, thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and you've got a great stage presence, and I've really enjoyed tonight. I've always been wanting to ask an expert on mindfulness, because I think we're one of the most self-aware and possibly self-conscious generations. So the overlap between self-consciousness and mindfulness, or the possible interference of both, because not enough is spoken.
Sure.
We speak about mindfulness as a panacea for everything, but actually we've got a huge degree of self-consciousness.
Well, it's interesting. Mindfulness is not self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is a thought, an anxious thought about yourself. What mindfulness does is give you an internal platform where you can observe thoughts and feelings without being caught by them. In other words, it changes your relationship to your own experience. So you see it as passing show. Self-consciousness comes up in the mind, and you see, oh, so there's self-consciousness. Then you let it go. You don't get sucked in to the self-consciousness, and that's true of whatever else may arise. And it's, you know, our biggest source of unhappiness generally is our own mind. So being able to, at will, create a different relationship to the contents of the mind is actually very freeing. So it's freeing from self-consciousness and actually the whole range of, you know, negative thoughts and feelings.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. And then a bit of a weird question as well. So sometimes what I find is that after reading a lot of positive psychology and such as your wonderful books, I sort of start to see the world in a rosy manner. But then I start to sometimes fail to realize how people can be miserable. And then in a way that can also distance myself from people around me because, so how do you sort of study unhappiness at the same time?
One of the interesting things is that mindfulness should go hand in hand with compassion. If you use it only to distance yourself from your own and other people's misery, that's not the point. The point is to free your attention because, you know, in the Good Samaritan study, it was because people were self-absorbed that they didn't stop to help. They didn't even notice the person. They're lost in their own thoughts, and we're usually self-absorbed. So this creates an internal platform where we have more space, which means our attention is freer to notice what's actually happening in the world. That includes misery. It's not that we want to ignore it. We actually want to notice it, and if we can do something about it, do something. Mark?
I'm afraid we're going to have to end questions there. So firstly, I just wanted to say, Dan, thank you so much for being here this evening and for sharing all of your wisdom. Please join me in thanking Dan for us today.
Great.
Such a lot of wisdom was shared with us this evening, and indeed very, very wise questions from this audience as well. I'm struck by how much of what Dan has said brings together so much of what many of us believe in this room. I was left with one major feeling, Dan, which is that when we look around so much of society we find ourselves in our workplaces, in our media, in our day-to-day lives, we find that so much of the wisdom that you've shared with us this evening isn't immediately obvious. And so I think what I was most struck by was this sense of we don't need to wait for the system to change. In fact, the system won't change unless people lead that change. So I think what you've helped really reignite for us this evening is this sense that we're all leaders and we can all be agents, as you said, agents in this conspiracy of building a happier world. So I'd like us to all leave with that message and maybe think as we leave this evening, how can we be more agents of the sort of change that Dan has inspired us with this evening? So thank you all so much for being here. I would just like to say that one of our forthcoming events this year is hopefully to see Richie Davidson, who Dan referred to so often in his talk, coming here to share some of his wisdom from the neuroscience perspective and a wonderful film that he's been involved in making. So we'll communicate more about that later in the year. But thank you so much for being here this evening and for all of your energy and contribution. And before we sign off, please do remember that we have two books here this evening. One is Dan's wonderful new book, Focus, which is available in the corner over here, which we'd highly recommend. And also, he mentioned his wife Tara's book. I think we have Mind Whispering here as well. So please do check those out. And finally, join me once again in thanking Dan so much for being here this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.